Hey, in this episode of Franchise Secrets, I have Edith on with FRANdata, and we are talking about why the grass is always greener on the other side and trends that she's seeing based on the data that she has with like everything in franchising. She's got it all. But there are some unique things that she's seeing with some of these emerging brands and what older established brands are doing. At one point in the podcast, I said, this is a doom and gloom episode. That I caught myself in saying, no, this is an extremely valuable episode for everybody in franchising. So I hope you enjoy the show.
Representing Franchise Secrets, Erik Van Horn.
Edith, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Now, there's no Daryl. He's not been on twice. You'll probably be on 3 times before he's on again, right?
So honored. To be fair, he is welcoming I think it's his 4th grandchild today.
Well, to be fair, I asked you to come on just to be fair. We'll have him on again, but I love you. All right. So
Feelings
what are we
mutual.
talking about? What are we talking about today?
Well, I think you said it earlier. The grass is always greener.
The grass is always greener. This is going to be super interesting to people. Brands, listen up. Buyers, listen up. There'll be some cautionary tales we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how old things become new and why. I mean, there's so many. This is going to be a fun one, but you give the audience a little bit of your history, because this is not just opinion. We're talking about a lot of data that you have to be able to have this discussion today. So give the audience like the brief overview.
Yeah. So FRANdata is a franchise market research company. We like to have an FBI file on every franchisor and franchisee. And we also have franchisor and franchisee customers. So we get a nice landscape of what people are thinking. And then we also get to look at the data. And we can look at the data going back to as early as when franchise systems start. So that's what's kind of informing what we're going to talk about today.
Before we get to that, what's the difference between data and data?
Whether you're in the US or Australia.
Is that it?
In Australia, it's FRANdata. In the US, it's FRANdata.
Well, sounds good. Well, I've got them. Sometimes I act like I'm Australian, and sometimes I'm stateside. So, all right, let's hop into it. Let's talk about like these 2 different growth models that franchisors are. Like, what you're seeing about 2 different growth models with franchisors.
Yeah. So when I said the grass is always greener, what I meant by that is I'm seeing a trend where franchisors are growing in 2 different ways. And they're not new ways. So they're ways that franchisors have always grown. But the interesting twist is that franchisors who have traditionally grown through what we'll call the owner-operator model are now looking to grow through multi-unit franchising or with financial players, whereas some very large franchise systems who have large operators are converting back and want to go back to the owner-operator model. So that's why we called it the grass is always greener.
What industries are we talking about? Because I can see, in my opinion, or what I would think initially is service-based brands were owner-operators and they were going after the owner-operator. And now they might be going more for like the investor model or somebody that can scale like large markets or multiple large markets. I think of like Brian Scudamore, because that's a service-based business. Went in here, got junk, but they have some very large operators and they've been doing that for a while. So am I correct in thinking a lot of the service-based businesses are now wanting to attract multi DMA type operators? or are we talking retail as well, or both?
Yeah. So traditionally, the businesses that have been in service, it like a lot of home service businesses or even children's services, where it was really paramount that the owner face was in front of the customer and in the community. So it was almost a sacrosanct model that the owner was the face of the business, go to those ball games and really helping to drive the customer relationships and experience. And so those industries are now what I'd say toying with the bringing in multi-unit operators where that individual owner doesn't need to be kind of on site, so to speak, and attracting multi-unit operators or financial players. And I will say they're doing it with a little bit of caution just to make sure that it works. But yes, you hit the nail right on the head.
So I think, like with what you just said, if someone is a buyer out there and a company says, hey, we were owner operator, now we are the investor model or semi-absentee model or passive, which I have strong opinions on passive. I have not seen passive work out there yet. But let's say it's semi-absentee where you are working on the business, not in the business. And this brand is saying, hey, we are now allowing semi-absentee ownership. And you're like, that's great because I hear so many great things about semi-absentee ownership. And you jump in without really validating semi-absentee ownership in that particular brand. You might be in for a surprise because you heard Edith say there are brands out there that are testing this right now. So if you go to validate with franchisees, and you hear everything's great, you're making this kind of money, you got a return on your investment, your business is worth X amount, and you would do it again. But they might be under that owner-operator model, or they were owner-operator that transitioned into semi-absentee because they were so hands-on in the beginning. That's not necessarily what you, as a new semi-absentee franchisee in this model, could probably expect to do. So I think that's my word of advice is just know what you're getting into. It's a bigger risk if you can't validate with current franchisees that are doing what you are going to do. Any thoughts around that, Edith?
Yeah, I think it's if you think about like what's the reason that's driving these brands to go in the opposite direction, I think that's really would be worth kind of exploring a little more. So if you go on the flip side, the brands who have traditionally had these very large operators, and now they're shifting to owner operators, onesie, twosies. So like, why are they doing that? So, everybody knows the brand Burger King, right? It's a ubiquitous brand, not unlike McDonald's. So Burger King, as an example, has had very large operators. But in last year, they had 4 different operators go into bankruptcy that affected 450 restaurants. So what happens when franchisees become very large, to some degree, many of them lose focus on operations, and it's more of financial play where they own assets and they're managing, the margins. And so what I found super interesting is, so Restaurant Brands International, who's the parent company of Burger King, they also own Tim Hortons, Firehouse Subs. They have a new CEO who's formerly with Domino's, and they were publicly trying to steer the sale of these bankrupt restaurants to smaller operators. And so you're like, okay, why? Well, clearly they want to get closer to the customer. They want the operator to be close to the customer. And like, if you think about, who the CEO of RBI is from Domino's, you can go into any Domino's and they are telling workers, like, you can own a Domino's. They're telling an individual who is just making pizza, Domino's, that they can own a Domino's. I have the the ability to look at the backgrounds of thousands of franchisees. And when I look at Domino's, just as an example, they have 86 franchisees that own 10 or more units, and they control about 50% of all of Domino's. I think they have 6,000, franchise locations. But when you look at who they are, so we try and investigate, like, what's their background? What were they doing before this? Are they an influential franchisee? Most of these franchisees, or a lot of them, were delivery drivers, right? So they know what it takes to operate a Domino's. They were so close to the customer, they were showing up at their houses, right? Like, you couldn't get any closer to the customer. So, it's this, I think these large brands, or brands who have large operators, are going back to the owner-operator model because they understand that in order to win in this very competitive environment, you need to have very crisp operations that are very close to the customer.
Attention, franchisors and franchisees. There are two really important resources that I want to share with you that will help you avoid costly mistakes and increase your enterprise value. The first is our free Facebook group. It's a community that has over 4,000 franchisees and franchisors in it. When somebody asks a question, they get honest and authentic answers from multiple perspectives. You can join the group for free over at franchisesecrets.com/Facebook. The second resource I want to share with you is if you're a franchisor and you're frustrated that you're not awarding as many franchises as you thought you would, this is the reason I created the Franchisor Mastermind. If you want access to the information, the techniques that the best franchise sales organizations are using to award franchises, and you want what mature brands have with their playbook of having happy, successful franchisees that grow the right way, then you might want to check out the Franchisor Mastermind. The reason why people join is they want access to my Rolodex, my connections. They want the playbook to achieve both short-term and long-term success. They want to increase enterprise value in their brand. Links will be in the show notes or at scalablefranchise.com. Do you see this in outside of food, like larger franchisors or trying to get like more hands-on franchisees? Like, is it in fitness? Is it in beauty? Or are we're talking two ends of the spectrum right now. We got home services and we've got food. Do you see any crossover, or is it basically those two segments right now?
It's a really great question. I would say that they're almost going in opposite directions, right? Food has had this time and ability for franchisees to grow and to be large. So when we look at all of the size of franchisees, the largest franchisees are predominantly in food. Now, fitness, like with Planet Fitness and some of the other fitness brands, those operators are starting to get very large. But the history of them having large franchisees isn't as long as food. So you kind of are seeing a little bit of going in the opposite direction. These other industries trying to grow with larger operators, having seen the success in food, and then food almost, buoying back to trying to go back to the way it used to be.
What are some of the largest food franchisees out there? Like, how many units do they have? How many brands do they have? And you can just give like rough numbers, but because audience may not understand when we're talking how large some of them might be, because I know there's some huge operators out there.
Yeah, so I think Greg Flynn with Flynn Group is the largest franchisee, and at this point I've kind of lost count because he has franchises in the Wendy's, Panera, Applebee's, let's see, Planet Fitness. He's in Australia, owns Wendy's in Australia, also owns a number of hotel brands. I'm sure I'm missing some, but the point is that like he has a very different strategy. He's looking for well-established brands. So brands that are known household names. So that's his strategy. There are other large franchisees. There's one that comes to mind called MB&M Brands that has grown very quickly. They're the largest Jimmy John's franchisee, but then they've been acquiring. So basically, they've been going in and acquiring sets of brands, sets of locations and different brands, and that's how they've grown to hundreds of locations in very short order. So I think Flynn owns over 1,200 locations across all of his different brands.
And some of these franchisees own hundreds of locations, and there's not just a couple of them. There's like, there's a lot of them that do that.
Bigger than most franchisors.
Yeah, bigger than most franchisors. And they're diversified. So it's interesting because they're diversified with different franchisors. But it's also interesting, too, when you have a franchisee that has such an impact on your brand. Like that's a risk when you have, them going bankrupt, certain franchisees going bankrupt. That can really hurt the brand, which hurts franchisees. Let's go back to service-based companies. So I think a lot of the audience, they're interested in like home services. I mean, it's been hot. I mean, has it always been that hot, or is it like since COVID? I think that whole category has taken off. Do you see that category? Like how much has that grown since COVID, home services in general?
Well, I came up with this term many years ago, pre-COVID, when Neighborly started being traded to different private equity firms, that there was an arms race to own the home. And so this was, this is a concept that is based on the fact that there's no major player that has been able to professionalize the home services and be a known brand, that it's such a fragmented market. And so there's a race to be that brand, to be to aggregate all of the services and to be known as that brand. So yes, I think that's what's been driving it, is that there's a recognition that there's a level of professionalism that can be brought to all of the services that go into the home. That being said, there's still no winner, right? It's still fragmented, and that's why we're continuing to see growth in that segment.
So you're talking about the grass is always greener. Some of these home service brands are now wanting, I don't know what the right term is, multi-unit or franchisees, multi-unit semi-absentee franchisees, because it's not necessarily units. But when you think of them wanting to be more like the restaurant space has traditionally been, like, is it just owning a whole market, like the Denver market? Is it owning Denver and Raleigh and Nashville? Like, what do you see as them that trend moving towards?
So I think there's it's interesting, when you look about running a business, you look at the complexity of running the business. And I remember talking to a franchisee who was a tropical smoothie franchisee, and what she said to me was really resonated. She said, when I'm growing and I'm dealing with kind of hourly staff, I feel like I need to be present. So when I'm growing my tropical smoothies, I want to be able to touch them. I've got to be able to touch them. But she was also growing with a Hand and Stone, where there's more professionalized staff that, in her mind, she could manage from a distance. So this ability to scale to different geographies, in her mind, was more accessible based on the staffing required. That's not to say that you can't have a multi-unit structure where you have a management structure in place in different geographies to manage. But I thought for someone who's kind of a mid-sized franchisee who doesn't have those layers in place, that was incredibly insightful. So you then translate that to service businesses. I would say that it depends on who your staff is and how tied in they are to running a clean and crisp operation.
It also comes with size. I mean, getting to a large enough area, large enough business to be able to hire that manager or director of operations or COO for your business, like that makes a huge difference. A friend of mine, Tommy Mello, it's not a franchise, but he owns a company called A1 Garage out of Phoenix, but they have multiple locations in a lot of different states. And he had a nice exit, but he's still on as the face of the company and working to grow that company. But, he is the CEO, and, he's been able to hire the right people and the right good people to be able to have this service-based business, do very well across multiple states. But it's about having the right people. And so I guess as I think about some of these service-based brands, whether it's window washing or power washing or restoration or whatever the thing is, Christmas lights, it's about getting to a large enough size to be able to hire people to remove you as the franchisee out of the day-to-day so you can focus on growing that actual business. Is that what you think? I mean, is that the goal? Is that what some of these franchisors are really like coaching and helping their franchisees with, or have you been able to get down to that level of detail?
I think it depends on the size of the brand, their ability to provide that level of support to the franchisee in terms of their scalability. I remember Yum Brands many years ago developed a multi-unit curriculum where the whole concept was, how do we help our single unit franchisees go from 1 to 2 or from 2 to 3, because these things are significant leaps. The problem with service brands is that when they sell multiple units, they're selling open field territory. And so what ends up happening is that franchisees are using those territories to farm what do we call the lowest hanging fruit. So you're getting the sales that are going to be the easiest sales, whereby if you only had a smaller territory, the franchisee might work a little bit harder to get that next level of sales. So the challenge that service-based businesses have is if they award too much territory to a franchisee, that they might not be able to manage generating the sales volumes that they need to, or that could be coming from those territories. So it almost becomes a lose-lose for the franchisor and for the franchisee, because the franchisee is servicing a large territory, which is taxing their ability to get from, one location to the next. And yet at the same time, so they're running a less profitable business than they could otherwise be. And then the franchisor is not getting the level of sales that they could be from those territories. So it is a bit of a chicken egg situation with service businesses when they're trying to grow too quickly with multiple territory sales to an individual franchisee.
And that is why, like what you just described, is why most franchisors make that big mistake on territories. It's a massive mistake, and I hear it all the time. They start to tell me why they're different. And one of the things they describe as their point of differentiation is we have larger territories and then all the competition. And like what you just described is that's not necessarily the best thing for a franchisee. It's not great for a franchisor because a franchisor wants deep penetration for customers in a particular market, but franchisees think they just want a larger market, and that's what's best for them. And it's not necessarily true. Let's dive deeper into that. Why do franchisors think a larger territory is better for franchisees? Why do they start out with, let's just call it a 5-mile radius versus a 3-mile radius? Why do they think that's the way to go?
It's a natural inclination for a franchisor to want to give their franchisee the best possibility to generating a meaningful business. So I don't think there's anything inherently like the thinking is a very positive way of thinking. They want the franchisee to be successful. And I think especially for an emerging brand where they only have, one or two locations themselves, and they might have themselves had a larger territory. And so they're building the model off of their business. And they also want to attract franchisees. And as a franchisee buying, for sure, I want the largest territory. I don't want anybody encroaching on my growth potential. So to me, all these reasons inherently make sense. There was a company who was looking to buy a franchisor, and I was looking at the territories, and there was one territory, I'm not even kidding, that spanned from Baltimore to DC. And I'm like, I live in Alexandria, Virginia. I don't want to go to Baltimore, right? Baltimore 95, like to service that big of an area is a disservice to me as a franchisee. So I think those are the reasons why. I think the other thing is, so on the one hand, people are selling large territories. On the other hand, service-based businesses are selling multiple territories at once, right? So like you buy 3, you buy 5, whatever. And what's driving that is a couple things, but one is, I find it astonishing right now how fast franchise brands are growing. So let me just give you an example. So Panera Bread, we all know Panera Bread, right? How fast do you think it took for Panera Bread to grow to 100 locations?
6 years?
10.
10.
It took Firehouse Subs 9 years. Now, if we look to today, a company like Seven Brews, they grew to 103 years. QC Kinetics. Open locations, not solds. QC Kinetics, 3 years. Crumble Cookie, 3 years. So when you look at like this is astonishing. 3 years to hit 100 locations. Now, Seven Brews, one of their franchisees is a Taco Bell franchisee, and they're opening a new unit every 2 weeks on average.
Wow.
So as a service-based business selling multiple territories, like when you have this steroid-like growth, like you almost have to sell multiple territories if you're going to experience that. You look at I've got a Monster Tree, right? Like they worked with an FSO and they grew 100 open locations in 2 years, right? So they already had some locations when they hired it. But my point is that this supercharged growth, the only way people are looking at how do you get there? Well, you can get there by doing this, what I'll call Panera Bread and Applebee model, where Panera Bread has like 24 franchisees that own 1,000 locations, or you have to sell, smaller, like 3 to 5 packs, as people, call them, to lots of franchisees to get to that kind of supercharged growth.
So supercharged growth, like most new franchisors want that. Like they want to get to 100 locations and they want to do it as fast as possible. I mean, we at Front Street, we talk to new brands every week. I'm talking to 3 to 5 brands every week, it seems like. And they all want to get there. Not all of them should get there. Most of them shouldn't grow that fast. You have to have the capital. You have to have the desire. Franchisors have to have the desire to work hard. That is not a passive investment for a founder of a franchisor to get to 100 open locations right away. I mean, in 2 years and in 3 years to get to 100 open locations, and there's some that are doing it in a year or thereabouts, 18 months. And that's incredibly fast. I would say it's not proven. Like when you get to that point, you don't have very many locations open and you're growing that fast. You might, hit a home run and you might not. You just have to know that as a franchisee or as a buyer. Some of these franchisors that have grown so fast, like it's because they've said we're a passive investment, and passive, like fully passive investment. The franchisor takes care of everything for you. And I'm, again, like I'll get in arguments with people because they'll come to me and say, oh, Erik, this is passive. I'm a franchisee. It is passive. 2 years later, Erik, can you help me sell this? This is not what I thought it was. Like those are conversations that I have on all these things that were sold as passive. Arguments that I had with friends, like it's not proven passive. You might think it is, but it's not proven. Oh, yes, it is, because the franchisor is going to do all this stuff for me. Well, I've not seen that come to be true yet. And then I just released a podcast a couple of weeks ago that talked about the only way that I see passive ownership is having an active operating partner. That's the only way that I've seen it work. Because I just don't understand how how people think a franchisor has a passive investment opportunity. It just doesn't make sense to me. If it was passive, they would get outside capital to continue to grow that thing themselves. So anyway, going back to like that speed to 100, why I don't even know if I have a question around that.
Well, I'll comment, because what you're talking about is like is fast growth sustainable? And so I think that at FRANdata, when we credit risk rate brands, we will credit risk rate them until they've been franchising for 5 years and have hit 50 units. So if a brand hit 50 units in 2 years, we're not going to credit risk rate them because we know that those units are not seasoned enough to know that they're actually sustainable. So what I see oftentimes is that there is a backlash. So essentially, like if I look at a business that grew very quickly to 100 units, when I have the ability to now look, many years later, what we see is that since the FSO got involved, it was like 7 years later, the franchise lost 100 businesses and now they're in decline, right? So like now they have fewer units, they're declining in total unit count. So it took a few years to get to that point where franchisees were closing their business. But that's not to say that fast growth always has a backlash. But it does oftentimes come with a backlash if it's riding a wave, like a consumer trend wave. Waves come up and then they go down, right? So if the brand is riding a wave, or if it's growing too fast and isn't franchisee profitability focused, then you're going to see a decline in the system over time.
You just described, when we're talking to brands, about like working with us, because we at Front Street, we have an FSO division, but we tell all brands, have you heard of this one term around FSOs? And I've never said this on a podcast before, but we call it the FSO hangover. Like you have this great, this great ride. You get 300 sold, 500 sold, whatever it is, and you have 100 open, and there's a hangover that can happen with brands once they've been with an FSO, then they get sold to private equity, and unfortunately, it impacts franchisees mostly at that point. You called it something different, but that's why at Front Street we try to do things differently, and we try to really be aligned with brands on the back end. So we're aligned with the brand to be focused on franchisee profitability. And internal conversations that we have with all of our brands all the time is about franchisee profitability, increasing revenue, things like that. I do see FSOs in general, more FSOs in general, starting to, and I'm curious on your thoughts on this and just kind of what you're seeing and hearing, or if you have data, but, or data, if you have data, if I see more FSOs kind of being, I don't see them caring more about good growth for the franchise brand. And if they are getting to the point where that growth is not helping that brand, they will stop or pause or, selling franchises for that brand, or franchisors do it themselves if they're not working with an FSO.
Yeah.
Are you seeing that a little bit more, or what are you seeing from your end?
Well, so I think there's two kind of things within what you just said. So I was so impressed with a brand. There's a multi-brand franchisor I was talking to, and they said, we're trying to grow these 3 brands and not this brand. And they had just acquired the brand. And they said, we have a lot of work to do to get this in a place that where growth becomes a priority again. And I just wanted to like bow at their feet and say, thank you, for all of us, think about all those people who own those businesses, focus on them to make the system more profitable, to put the structures in place, support, whatever. They didn't go into details about what they were working on, but whatever it is, growth was not it. And I think there's also a focus from a regulatory standpoint on brokers and FSOs. And so it's really in their best interest to be caring beyond the sale. So like whether they're doing it out of the goodness of their own heart, which I'm sure that is the case. And also because...
No, you're not sure. That's a good point that you just brought up. Because that is true. There's pressure, outside pressure coming on them to probably make different types of decisions. So that's an excellent point. Keep going on that.
Yeah, because you're not selling a loaf of bread, right? You're not even selling a car. You're selling what could be someone's retirement savings. What could be an SBA loan that could be future income that's being deducted from their checkbook, from their paycheck if they haven't paid their SBA loan because they closed a business. So this is, talk about a hangover. That's could be the most severe hangover you ever have.
Could be bankruptcy. I mean, I know franchisees that go bankrupt because, and like sometimes it's the franchisee's fault. I'd see a lot of franchisees doing stupid stuff and they're not really running their business. But I've also seen franchisors that are poor franchisors, and there's a trail of destruction with bankrupt franchisees because the franchisor really was not a good franchisor.
Yeah. I mean, listen, the thing that one of my friends, when she first became a franchisee, I was just so wildly impressed with their startup package. Not like I'm buying something, the package, which is the support. So that really helping people get from zero to break even, that period. I remember, I think it was Ace Hardware. One of the brands in the retail space told me if a franchisee fails before 18 months, it's their fault. If they fail after 18 months, it's the franchisee's fault. That was the way that they took ownership of launching a franchisee to success. And again, that's the type of mindset that I think of a franchisor should have with respect to caring for these people who are, putting a lot on the line to run their own business. Now, there's always going to be failures, right? So even, the Panera Breads of the world they have closures. So nothing is 100% guaranteed. No one should ever go in with that expectation. That's silly. Business comes with risk, but it's what is each party doing to mitigate those risks to increase the likelihood to have a successful outcome.
We've talked a lot of gloom because a lot of truth though. I mean, I think this has been a helpful episode for franchisors and buyers. Like, franchisors should be listening to this. I mean, this is a cautionary tale for emerging brands, and be careful who you partner up with, get advice from. And the best thing to do, I think, for an emerging franchisor that's trying to decide their growth strategy, do they go with an FSO? How do they vet an FSO? How quickly should they grow? What does their corporate structure look like? I would say go to some of these industry conferences. Like, go to some of these IFA conferences, go to Springboard, go do places where you can talk to franchisors that have been in your shoes, because good luck trying to get on a phone call with them. People try to get on a call with me all the time. I'm sure they do with you. And we just don't have time outside of these industry events just to be helpful to people, like, to give them advice on a phone call or on a Zoom session. But if you go to some of these events, you'll see Edith walking around, and go talk to her. You'll see me walking around, talk to me. And there's people that are much smarter, more experienced than I am at these conferences. And like, that's where some of these emerging brands should go, and not just to try to get franchisees or tell people how great they are or about their brand, but go there trying with a list of a handful of questions to understand how you want to grow and the advantages and disadvantages to growing that way and how they really got there. Like, you need to go deep with questions and ask lots of follow-ups to really uncover the challenges that franchisors face as they grow to 100 units. And I would be getting advice from brands that have 100 units open, they have high satisfaction with their franchisees, and they admit the mistakes that they made along the way. Oh, anything to add on that, or advice that you would have for some of these emerging franchisors?
Growth is good. So you said this is a bit of gloomy podcast, and I thought, what I guess the advice is just that when you're signing up franchisees, don't just think about that step, but really roadmap out fully that startup phase and what's the expectation of when they should hit break even, so that you are helping the franchisee put themselves into the best position for success. So to me, and if that is a core focus, whether that's, in the service-based businesses, how do you get customers, right? Like, how do you generate revenue? And doing pre-sales, marketing, like having additional resources to help generate those sales that franchisees can pay for, right? Like, this is not a free lunch, but it has to be a win. If you're thinking in that win-win, then, growth is good.
Yeah, that's good advice. And I think, one of the things that we at Front Street have been very laser focused on is that ramp up, like the franchisees ramp up when they get in. Like, how do they get customers right away, customer acquisition? How do they keep those customers, and how do you increase the average ticket? And really, franchisors should be focused on, franchisee break even point. And I love what you said about, some of these brands are like, it's my responsibility to get them to that at 18 months. If I can get them to where they're supposed to be in 18 months, if they fail, it's on me as a franchisor. After that, it's on them. I've been doing more podcasts on like kind of grand opening, training before, they start open up their locations or start trying to acquire customers. Like, lots of training, and then just really having that go-to-market strategy that works, and it's not based off of referrals. Some franchisors that I hear, like, how do you get customers? Oh, it's easy. We get lots of referrals. Well, a new brand, a new franchisee in a new market that's never heard of you before, they can't rely on referrals. There's got to be a really good, robust customer acquisition strategy and grand opening strategy, and how to get to whatever that benchmark or KPI is, whether it's 1,000 customers. For me, in one of my brands right now that I'm a passive owner in. It's 200 customers, 200 contracts. That is it. We are 150 right now, and we're going to open up in 1 month, and we will, based on our history, we will open up at over 200 customers. But every franchisor should know those metrics and be able to help franchisees get there, and understand that your new franchisees are so scared, and you need to understand that as a franchisor as well, and not shift blame to franchisees, because it's easy to do, because franchisees operating out of fear early on are probably making a lot of bad decisions, and they will put a lot of blame on the franchisor. But if you're just consistent, hold the franchisee accountable, give them the roadmap and a plan that actually works, like that's what franchisors should be focused on. Any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of times emerging or new brands don't know, right? Because we haven't done it enough times, and that's okay. So then it's your first franchisees you're working with to figure out what those KPIs should be. So that's why it's advantageous to go a little bit slower to figure out those KPIs. And once you've got those locked in, then you can start to grease the wheels, so to speak, and then go a little faster.
Everyone, doom and gloom wasn't the right framing for this. This is accurate franchising. Like what we just talked about here is very accurate for emerging brands. I think, just as I was thinking about buyers in here, they're just like, oh my gosh, this doesn't sound easy. Well, franchising is not easy as a franchisor or as a franchisee. And that's okay. If it was, everybody would do it. And I think buyers, like, this is really good for you to listen to this, because you can't believe everything you hear in a franchise development sales process. You have to go validate that. And I'm a big fan of validating the industry. If what you hear, if it's window washing, I don't have a window washing brand, but if it's window washing and you're hearing profits of 80% and gross revenue of $1 million, which is just crazy. So if you're hearing something and then you go validate that with a mom and pop and multiple mom and pops or just industry benchmarks, if it's way off, you probably need to dig deeper. If it's in line, then you're probably, on the right path. But I think the point of this is just get educated as a buyer, and franchisors just understand what slow growth, medium growth, hyper fast growth really looks like, and be careful on what you sign up for. Any thoughts or last bits of wisdom, Edith?
Yeah, if you're a new franchisee who's signing up with a newer brand, Erik, I shared this story with you earlier. I would hold the franchisor accountable as a franchisee. I'm in the position where lots of people talk to me about various experiences, and I was talking to someone who works at an SBA lender. Half of their portfolio is franchising, so very familiar franchising. And he told me about his best friend who invested in a new brand. It's a passive business.
Air quotes, passive business.
And he was paying the franchisor $2,000 a month for a call center. And he closed in less than 18 months because he got 6 calls. So if you're going to pay, if it's a new brand, you're going to pay $2,000 a month. What am I going to get for that? If no one's calling, I still have to pay you. What's the service? So go get me some leads. Like, if I'm going to pay you $2,000 a month, like, go find me some leads. So that's what I would do, is just, especially with a new brand, is to hold them accountable to like anything that they're charging you for. And for franchisors, just have that mindset of, what it truly is the service that the franchisee is getting.
Edith, I think we just helped some people out. I think we helped some franchisors out and some franchisees. So thank you. Thank you for your friendship, and thank you for all you do in franchising. And I hope to see you at one of these conferences before the year is up.
I hope so too. This is a lot of fun, as always.
Thanks for listening to the Franchise Secrets podcast. Links to everything can be found over at franchisesecrets.com. And if you want my help with anything from starting your own franchise to growing your current franchise business, please visit scalablefranchise.com.